Welcome back, friends. And today we are going to decode one of the earliest and most influential schools of literary criticism, formalism. Imagine stepping into a world where literature is not tied to history, politics, or the author's personal life, but exists as a world of its own. That's exactly what the formalists argued. Literature is autonomous, self-contained, and best understood by examining its internal features. Pause here and note this down. Formalism emphasizes what is inside the text. That means grammar, syntax, meter, tropes, imagery, and style. It deliberately rejects external influences such as the author's biography or the political climate. Instead, it asks us to focus on the structure and form of the text itself. Two concepts from this school have been asked in exam: defamiliarization and foregrounding. Defamiliarization means making the familiar seem strange, so that readers notice the form of language itself instead of just gliding past it. Foregrounding works in a similar way, drawing attention to stylistic devices so the artistry of the text stands out. Can you recall who summed up the formalist belief most clearly? It was Roman Jakobson. He said, "The object of study in literary science is not literature, but literariness, that is, what makes a given work a literary work." Asked in exam. This powerful idea shifted attention from content to the unique qualities that give literature its identity. Formalism developed mainly in two schools. First, Russian formalism in the early 20th century, with thinkers like Viktor Shklovsky and Jakobson himself. Then, its Anglo-American cousin, New Criticism, which rose in the mid-20th century. Both movements believed literature could and should be studied scientifically, almost like linguistics, with rules, structures, and systems. Another key contribution was the book Theory of Literature by René Welleck and Austin Warren, first published in 1948 and revised in 1955 and 1962. This work gathered formalist insights into a systematic framework, giving teachers and critics a practical guide to studying literature as an autonomous art form. Pause here, this is a classic UGC trap. Formalism reminds us that literature has its own history, its own science, and its own logic. It's not just about what a text says, but how it says it. By foregrounding language and form, the formalists made sure that the very artistry of literature, the sound, rhythm, and structure, was treated as the essence of the literary experience. So, whenever you see the term formalism, think of it as a call to focus inward on the text itself, its form, its devices, and its unique literariness. Picture yourself in Russia during the early 20th century, a time of revolution, not just in politics, but in the way literature itself was understood. Between the 1910s and the 1930s, a group of thinkers began asking a bold question. What if literature is not a mirror of society, but a system with its own rules? This was the birth of Russian formalism. Names like Viktor Shklovsky, Yuri Tynyanov, Vladimir Propp, Boris Eichenbaum, Roman Jakobson, Boris Tomaszewski, and Grigory Gukovsky became central to this movement. Instead of reading literature as psychology or history, they insisted on treating it as an independent science of language, something with its own methods and internal laws. Pause here and note this down. One of their biggest contributions was a fresh way of looking at literary history. Instead of asking what social events shaped this work, they asked what new forms and techniques pushed literature forward. For them, the evolution of art was driven by formal innovation. Can you recall who gave us the most famous idea of this school? It was Viktor Shklovsky. In his essay, Art as Technique, he coined the term defamiliarization, and this was asked in exam. The idea is simple, but powerful literature makes the familiar strange. Through unusual language or unexpected images, it forces us to see everyday things as if for the first time. That strangeness wakes us up, slows our perception, and reminds us that art is not about repeating reality, but transforming it. This scientific precision deeply shaped later movements. Structuralists like Mikhail Bakhtin and Yuri Lotman inherited their emphasis on systematic analysis. Even when Russian formalism declined under Soviet pressures in the 1930s, its spirit lived on. Across the ocean, new criticism in America carried forward the same focus on close reading and intrinsic form, dominating classrooms in the early half of the 20th century. So, while Russian formalism was short-lived, its influence is lasting. It gave us the tools to see literature not as a shadow of history, but as an art form with its own mechanics driven by language, structure, and technique. Imagine Moscow in the early 20th century, a city alive with revolutionary change, not only in politics but also in ideas about language and literature. Between 1915 and 1924, a group of scholars came together to form what became known as the Moscow Linguistic Circle. Their goal was bold: to make the study of literature and language as systematic and scientific as possible. This circle included some of the most important names in early literary theory: Roman Jakobson, Grigory Vinokur, Boris Tomaszewski, and Petr Bogatirev. Though it was originally founded by Philip Fortunatov, it was Jakobson who soon emerged as the intellectual driving force. What united them was a belief that literature should not simply be studied as history or psychology, but as a system in itself, something governed by rules, patterns, and forms. Pause here and note this down. The Moscow Circle played a central role in shaping Russian formalism. Their discussions on the structure of poetic language and the autonomy of linguistic systems gave critics new ways to analyze texts. They also introduced a semiotic perspective, treating literature as a system of signs rather than just stories. Can you recall where these ideas traveled next? Exactly to the Prague Linguistic Circle. When Jakobson and his colleagues moved there, they expanded these insights into a full-fledged theory of structural linguistics and literary semiotics. This is how Moscow became the starting point for a European-wide intellectual movement. By combining linguistics with literary analysis, the Moscow Linguistic Circle helped establish literature as an objective discipline. Their influence can't be overstated. They built the bridge from Russian formalism to later structuralism and semiotics. So, even though the circle itself lasted less than a decade, its legacy shaped the very foundations of how we think about language, literature, and meaning. Imagine a small cafe in Prague during the 1920s, a gathering place where some of the brightest minds in language and literature came together. From those conversations at Cafe Derby grew what we now call the Prague Linguistic Circle, better known as the Prague School. Formally established in 1928, it became one of the most influential intellectual societies of its time, active throughout the 1930s. And yes, this has been asked in exam. The group included famous figures like Roman Jakobson, Nikolai Trubetskoy, Sergei Karsevsky, René Velek, Jan Mukajovsky, Bohuslav Havranek, Wilhelm Matthäus, and Ludwig Winder. What brought them together was a shared goal to build a rigorous framework for studying language and literature. At the heart of their work was a focus on the poetic function of language, how words are arranged not just to communicate but to create beauty and aesthetic effect. Pause here and note this: the real strength of the Prague School lay in how it blended two approaches, structuralism and functionalism. Structuralism looked at how elements of language fit together into a system, while functionalism asked what role does each element play in communication. By combining the two, they were able to see language both as a structured system and as a living, dynamic tool that adapts to social context. Can you recall why this mattered? Because this approach didn't stop at literature. It spread into semiotics, the study of signs, and influenced fields as wide-ranging as psycholinguistics, sociolinguistics, comparative linguistics, computational linguistics, and applied linguistics. In other words, their ideas shaped not just how we read poems and novels, but also how we understand everyday communication, cross-cultural exchange, and even how computers process language. So, the Prague Circle wasn't just an intellectual club, it became a cornerstone of 20th century linguistics and criticism. By situating language within both structure and function, they laid the groundwork for modern literary theory and semiotic analysis. Their influence continues to ripple across disciplines even today. Imagine reading a story where something utterly ordinary suddenly feels strange, fresh, and almost magical. That's the legacy of Viktor Shklovsky, one of the leading figures of Russian formalism, and yes, this was asked in exam. In 1917, Shklovsky wrote his famous essay, Art as Technique, later translated as Art as Device. In this essay, he gave us one of the most important concepts in literary theory, ostraniny, or defamiliarization, and remember, this too was asked in exam. What did he mean? Simply that the task of art is to take the familiar and make it unfamiliar again. By presenting ordinary objects and experiences in new, surprising ways, art wakes us up. It forces us to see the world not as routine, but as if for the first time. Pause here and note this down. Shklovsky later expanded this idea in the opening chapter of his book Theory of Prose, published in 1925. He showed how narrative structures and literary devices are not neutral, they actively shape our perception. Now, here's something that often comes in exam traps. Shklovsky also gave us the crucial distinction between fabula and sujet. Can you recall what they mean? Fabula is the raw chronological sequence of events, the story, as it would happen in real life. Sujet, on the other hand, is how the author arranges and presents those events in the text, the plot. This separation highlights the creative power of form. It shows us that meaning doesn't come from events alone, but from how those events are structured. Through these innovations, Shklovsky became the beating heart of Russian formalism's scientific approach to literature. His focus on devices, structure, and estrangement influenced later thinkers like Mikhail Bakhtin and the Prague School of semiotics. So, next time you hear the term defamiliarization, remember, it's not just about making things strange. It's about renewing perception, breaking the dullness of habit, and reminding us that literature is not a mirror of life, but an artistic reorganization of experience. That's why Shklovsky remains central to the study of literary form. Imagine opening a book of Russian folk tales and wondering what makes all these different stories feel so similar. That's exactly the question Vladimir Propp, a Soviet folklorist and philologist, set out to answer. His work became so influential that it was asked in exam. In 1928, he published his groundbreaking study, Morphology of the Folktale. Propp argued that instead of focusing on abstract themes, we should look at the basic building blocks of stories, the actions of characters, and the functions these actions serve. He discovered that no matter how different the tales looked on the surface, their structures followed predictable patterns. Pause here and note this down. Propp identified 7 archetypal character roles. They are the villain, the donor, the helper, the princess, the dispatcher, the hero, and the false hero. Recognize these, and suddenly many folktales start to look like variations of the same formula. Propp showed that stories aren't random, they follow a logic, almost like a grammar of narrative. His method was called syntagmatic analysis, which means studying how these narrative functions are combined in sequence. For example, a villain creates a problem, a helper provides aid, and a hero completes the quest. This sequence builds the skeleton of the tale. But Propp's ideas also sparked debate. Claude Lévi-Strauss, the anthropologist, felt that Propp's focus on sequence missed something deeper. Instead of syntagmatic structures, Lévi-Strauss emphasized paradigmatic ones, the underlying oppositions like life versus death or nature versus culture that myths often revolve around. Still, Propp's contribution was revolutionary. By reducing folk tales to recurring roles and functions, he gave us a scientific method for analyzing stories. His influence carried into structuralism, semiotics, and narratology, shaping the way we study narratives even today. So the next time you hear a fairy tale, think of Propp. It's not just a story, but a system, a set of roles and moves, repeating again and again across cultures. That's all for Chapter 11, Formalism Unlocked. We've covered the movements, the thinkers, and the key exam points. All the lesson plans, videos, PDFs, PYQs and last minute notes are ready for you. Download the app now and keep your preparation one step ahead.